You're coming, perhaps even good evening. My name is Ryan Meyer. I'm based here at University of California, Davis, and I serve as the track lead for community and citizen science in the Science and Society section of AGU, and really excited about the event we have planned today. And this is a part of the Science and Society Dialogues series that has been happening over the course of the summer and into the fall. Before we get started on the specific topic for today, which is community and citizen science, I want to briefly introduce Kevin Reed, who is the president-elect for Science and Society at AGU, to give a little bit of context and a little bit of background on the section. So take it away, Kevin.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, I just wanted to, again, welcome everybody to our Science and Society Dialogue and just give you a little bit of background about the Science and Society section at AGU. So the Science and Society section is a relatively new section at AGU that's really focused on supporting and growing a community that actively facilitates stronger connections between societies and earth and space sciences. And this is really in line with the expertise that's been outlined in the strategic plan for AGU. And it also focuses really on fostering innovation within AGU that better enables discoveries and solutions in the geosciences that benefit humanity. Just really quick, the section is organized into 5 main tracks that are one of them, of course, which is for the dialogue today, which is related to community and citizen science, but we also have tracks related to art and science and science policy. And then there's also additional tracks on science communication and social and behavioral science. So as I turn it back to Ryan, I just want to again thank you for coming, and just for those of you that are interested or come out of this end of this with a great interest in learning more about the Science and Society section, just Google AGU Science and Society, and you'll find actually a couple more dialogues that we have coming up in 3 weeks and 6 weeks related to some of the other tracks. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to you, Ryan.
Right. Thank you so much, Kevin. And this is an outdated graphic. I put blue boxes around the 2 that are coming up. The social and behavioral sciences is actually later in the fall. So check out that URL if you're interested in more of these dialogues. And there are recordings up on this website as well, if you'd like to go back and look at some previous dialogues events. So before I introduce our panelists, I just want to give a brief overview of how we're defining this term community and citizen science. There are a lot of different terms. You might have heard of participatory action research or community-based participatory research. There are many different participatory science terms. We use this term community and citizen science very broadly here within the Science and Society section at AGU. And you can find this definition on the website that Kevin mentioned also. And, very broadly, this is the idea about doing science with folks who may not have a professional science degree or may not self-identify as a scientist. And it can have a lot of different purposes. It can serve a lot of different goals, and that's what kind of makes it exciting. And there are a lot of different reasons to get into this work, whether it's the kinds of relationships you're interested in, the kinds of community goals that might be at the heart of it, and the kinds of data that scientists may be trying to pursue. And so we're going to get into that a little bit today. With that, I'm really excited to introduce quickly each of the 3 panelists that we have who have fantastic perspectives and experience on community and citizen science. Before I do those quick intros, I just want to say, love to have interaction in the chat throughout this session. If you have thoughts or questions, we're also going to try to leave time at the end for a little bit of more sort of interactive dialogue. And so if you have questions that you want to discuss, please do hold on to those, and we'll try to make time at the end. So our first panelist is Dr. Jennifer Shirk, who serves as the executive director of the Citizen Science Association. So it's good to know there's a whole professional association dedicated to this topic. And a lot of great overlaps with what we are trying to sort of facilitate and build here at AGU, and what Citizen Science Association is doing. The conferences they hold are extremely engaging and just fun experiences to connect with practitioners and researchers. And I'm sure Jennifer will have more to say about that. Jennifer also investigates how academic and agency scientists make a space for these kinds of partnerships. So her research is also really fantastic for, I think, AGU folks to learn about. We're also joined by Skye Kelty, Dr. Skye Kelty, I should say, who, in addition to being the chemical hygiene officer for San Jose State University, has got tremendous expertise in community-driven research and issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice in research. And she co-founded the Knights Landing Environmental Health Project, which is just north of where I'm standing right here today. It's just an amazing example of what researchers can do in a community when they bring the right mindset and resources to the table. So Skye will have more to say about that. And then last but not least, Natasha Urugama. Dr. Natasha Urugama is manager of community and international relations with AGU's own Thriving Earth Exchange, which is a great organization to know about if you haven't gotten to know it already. And so in that role, she's responsible for identifying, building, and nurturing partnerships with community-serving organizations and leading international program development. She's worked closely with communities to ensure that leads are able to work equitably and sustainably within community science teams and to have impactful tools and solutions. So really excited to have the different perspectives on this panel. And with that, I will get us started with Jennifer, if you'd like to share your slides. Do you have slides, Jennifer? I'm sorry, I didn't ask previously.
You know what, I wasn't planning on it, but our other two presenters do, and it's always nicer to look at pictures, I think, than just a speaker. So I will go ahead and share what I have. And great. Well, thank you for this opportunity to connect and be part of this conversation. As Ryan mentioned, this is really a conversation at the heart of the work that I aim to support through a professional association for this movement of research and monitoring done by, for, and with people beyond academic and science-driven institutions. So a little bit personally about what brings me to this. I come out of a background of both conservation research and conservation education, and these are both action-oriented fields, action-oriented areas of practice. And it was becoming clear in the mid to late 90s when I was involved in both of these areas of work that neither one of them alone, research or education, was sufficient to drive change. Certainly each were necessary, but research questions alone were missing the mark. They weren't necessarily actionable. They were asking the wrong kinds of things in the midst of complex situations where agencies, members of the public, the media, and the press all had thoughts on the kinds of change to make. And at the same time, an education frame was bringing a deficit model to an area of work and conversation where collaborators, stakeholders, people invested in conservation change brought their own depth of knowledge to an issue. And what was really needed was a way to develop more shared understandings that would give us together the capacity to make informed and sustainable change. So I came at this also with some experience from my younger days with local and public-driven monitoring and research, whether that was through, as a high school student, I took part in an Earthwatch expedition. I also had a chance in my hometown to be part of water monitoring efforts. And so I knew it was possible for public insight and research to have a shared space and a shared venue. And in the mid to late 90s, I found my way to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where these movements and these existing traditions were gaining new momentum under the term citizen science. And long story short, I ended up taking on this question of why scientists were pursuing these unconventional approaches to doing research, and in particular, what was making that possible and what barriers still needed to be broken down for these research approaches to take place within a scientific career. So it was hard, you know. These are things that some of the questions I know many of you may be familiar with, and thankfully some we've gotten past. Questions as to data quality, whether it was important and useful for scientists to invest time and resources in engaging with the public. And certainly these were not skills that many of the scientists I spoke to were trained in. And absolutely, they were not part of the reward structures. And yet what I was finding was that these researchers were really employing a rich range of options to collaborations around data collection and research for change that gave some new power to asking relevant questions at actionable scales. And this was everything from addressing local concerns where questions had to do with livelihoods and sustainable resources, to looking at larger scale questions such as global bird counts, where there were centuries of data that were beginning to help us understand and to flag trends. And at the same time that I was pursuing this research, I was working with a team of other scholars who were starting to describe some of these different approaches in relationship to how the collaborations were taking shape. And just to illustrate in a very oversimplified form, defining them as contributory, collaborative, and co-created, largely based on whether a scientific institution is driving a question and asking for contributions of samples or observations, or approaches that range from more collaborative to collectively generated projects where even the questions are coming from members of the public themselves and then being worked through this whole process in conjunction with researchers. And today we are currently talking about these using a term C sciences, in particular to describe contributory, collaborative, and co-created. Sometimes people see that as the community and citizen science approaches, but it's much broader than that. And at the time, in fact, even 10 years ago, we were using a different term. It was public participation in scientific research, recognizing that citizen science wasn't necessarily effectively describing this whole range of options. And it was under that term that the Citizen Science Association was launched at a meeting of the Ecological Society of America in Portland, Oregon. So 10 years ago, and since then, in conjunction with scientific societies, including ESA, as well as AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and now lightly in partnership and increasingly in partnership with the American Geophysical Union, CSA serves as a practice-focused association that spans disciplines and roles to bring people together to make these practices possible. So we're member-driven. We connect people from all of the skill sets and areas that are required to make these partnerships thrive. So that's academics, it's also community leaders, it's people who are ethicists and data specialists and many more across this wide range of practices where we're using research and monitoring that's done by, for, and with members of the public. And this boundary spanning position allows us to take real deep dives into critical practices. For example, ethics. So looking across all of those approaches to research, how can we be an association that stands up for and guides practitioners through tough ethical questions related to when and how data should be open, what kinds of privacy concerns can be established and put in place, and so forth. We are also able to work collectively to develop standards like metadata standards for describing data and efforts to collect data collaboratively. And this PPSR core metadata standard works in conjunction with other metadata practices for sharing, for example, biodiversity data. And there's a lot more that I could talk about, but one that I did want to flag in particular, because some of our collaborators are on this call, and you'll hear from one in just a moment. Skye Kelty has been part of our working group that is focused on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and has helped to work across this field to further that acronym and help develop principles that now also include things like integrity in collaborations and research, as well as funding parity when it comes to building collaboration. So as an association, we do stand for both integrity in science and integrity and engagement, and the way those things come together. So just briefly, and moving on so that we can hear from Skye, we connect people throughout the year. We share practices through an open access peer-reviewed journal that is focused on the theory and practice related to research. And increasingly, we're working to build an understanding of the many different ways that people talk about and draw on traditions from across this broad field, whether that is from approaches related to public engaged science, volunteer monitoring and participatory research, and looking at the way that everyone can come together around this work. In particular, these two stories illustrated here are of scientists who have embraced the practices necessary to build these partnerships. So Ryan mentioned our conference. We do connect people around critical questions, and here are some. This is from our last event this past May, and we're looking forward to a 2023 in-person event the end of May in Phoenix, Arizona. So I will look forward to talking more about that. But for now, I'll just look forward to discussions and ways that we can keep this conversation going across these many practices and disciplines where we're doing and are invested in this work to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I think we'll move right along to Skye. It was a great segue. And as I said before, discussion at the end. It looks like we're on track to have some good time left for that. So take it away, Skye. Thank you again, Jennifer.
Hey everyone. So my task today is to sort of break down what an expert is for community science, citizen science, sea science. And I'm going to share a little bit about my story and actually some of my family story as part of this. And I'll share some stories from communities that I've worked in across America. Just to give you an example of what it's really like to find these experts and value them within your research as an environmental scientist. I'm going to turn off my video so that I preserved a little bit of bandwidth so you can see all the pictures. But yeah, I hope you'll enjoy it. All right, so just getting started, this is me. I grew up in a family of geologists. My dad is a professor of geology. My mom's a geophysicist. My uncles are both pretty intense geologists. My brother geologist. So I love AGU. We have all these journals all over my house. Like this is like coffee table reading in my house. So thank you to this group for keeping my childhood interesting. And for me, right, this is how I grew up. This is what I'm familiar with, is going out to the desert. All of our family pictures have some sort of rock in them. And just being immersed in that, you know, I don't have a degree in geology, right? But there's a certain amount of expertise and love for this field that I have, just by being around such passionate geologists all the time. I'm also going to just point out, just because there's a really great picture of my dad and I in Mongolia with his driver, Omgala. And this is one of his citizen scientists that he worked with for like 15 years in Mongolia. Omgala does not speak English and my dad does not speak Mongolian, but they for 15 years have collaborated, driving all over that country and mapping fault lines. So I just want y'all to appreciate some of those folks within your work, maybe your drivers, maybe your collaborators, local collaborators, maybe the landowners that you work with. They'll end up in your family photos, and right, they're a part of the story as well, and they're experts within that work. On the other side of my family history, we have a lot of other people that love the environment. So my grandpa is a World War II pilot. One of my favorite stories is his electric went down while he was flying his family. So he was able to navigate back to LA by having my mom find Disneyland, and then just was able to bring the plane in, no electric controls at all, full manual, with no panic, right? And my grandma was fine. Everyone was very confident in his abilities. And I'm going to say that he's not a scientist, right? Like, he's not an engineer, he's not a scientist. He sold bikinis. So it's surprising sometimes how much knowledge folks can have just from that previous experience, right? Another fun family member, this is Uncle Jeff. He's a surfer. That's him surfing at the beach I grew up at, and then him now today surfing with his dog there. So he has this tremendous knowledge of the ocean, right? He understands the tides. He's out catching the swell whenever he can. So that's something that I've always appreciated growing up, having my surfer Uncle Jeff, and going out night surfing with him, and just getting that deep understanding of the ocean and appreciation, being out there with dolphins, right? He's not a marine biologist, he's not a scientist, he sells stocks, but he has this great understanding of the environment I grew up in. And then finally, I'd love to share my Uncle Jamie's story. So he's a sailor. He's one of the last square riggers on the planet. I think there's 5 left. And yeah, and ever since he was a young man, he's been traveling the high seas, fixing boats all over the world. So once again, that deep knowledge of the ocean, deep knowledge of navigation by stars, all these things. He didn't graduate college, and he's pretty much a philosopher. So also not a scientist, but that deep knowledge of our natural systems, just from his passion for the environment. So that's just something I love to share, that when I go out into communities, right, I'm trying to find my Uncle Jamie out there. I'm trying to find Uncle Jeff, my grandpa, out when I work with communities, because you know, they know much more about their own environment and their own neighborhood, their own community, than I ever will as a stranger coming in. Yeah. So as part of that, this is the other side of my childhood. I grew up next to a refinery. You can see that flare from the school I went to. We used to do shelter in place drills for chemical accidents. So we do our earthquake drill, and we do our shelter in place drill for chemical accidents each year. And there was actually a severe explosion near my house. And my dad's a petroleum geologist. So this hit pretty close to home for me, as something that was scary and something I was worried about. My friends getting sick, you know, people like my dad on the job, potentially being in a severe accident at work, doing an explosion like this. So growing up in a childhood, I started to get into activism at that point. Trying to address some inefficiencies in our fuel system, and getting involved in just general protection of the environment through activism. When I was a youth, Then I started going out of my comfort zone. This is Houston. You might notice that those refineries look really similar to the one next to my house. I started working with Tejas there. So the Paras family, Urusnias, there's amazing youth organizing going on in the Houston area related to these refineries and the disease that it causes in communities. And I was able to bring a lot of that childhood experience to this, right? Of my family of geologists, my understanding of the petrochemical industry, and yeah, my knowledge that, chemical shelter in place drills exist, and that's I wasn't the only one that had to do those. I also started getting into more natural disaster environmental science. So there's some pictures here of wildfires and hurricanes flooding out these industrial facilities. That's been a big part of my life as well, growing up in wildfires in California, and bringing that knowledge to these projects has been really helpful. Then I started ending up in more unfamiliar places. So this is a farming community in Central California. This is where I worked with Alfonso Aranda and the community of Knights Landing, California, to do my PhD research. They're experiencing high rates of cancer that are slipping through the cracks of our county epidemiology. So we went out there to try to bring some environmental science help. But as you might imagine, as someone who grew up in the desert and, beaches and sort of cities, this is very unfamiliar territory to me. A town of 1,000 people was the size of my high school. So for me, finding local experts that understood what the crops were and how to drive a tractor and all these sorts of things, it was absolutely critical for my dissertation to actually represent the reality in this community and to be actionable by that community. One of my favorite examples, I was looking at pesticide application data over many years, and I was expecting there to be less pesticides during the drought, a huge drought that happened because, right, there's not enough water, they're not growing as much crop, you wouldn't use as much pesticide. We found the opposite, that there was actually more pesticides applied during the drought and less during a time of higher rain. And then I went to my research partner, Alfonso, who's from a farming community, and is an expert in the history of farming communities. And he laughed at me and said, Sky, it was the recession. They couldn't get loans. That's why they weren't applying pesticides, right? It was a totally human problem. And that's something I had to learn. Here's another unfamiliar environment. This is more green than I've ever seen at any other point in my whole life. These are the swamps in Louisiana. Here I worked with Mike Tridico, and this is sort of a little outside of Lake Charles, Louisiana. And the folks in this community of Mossville and Bayou Dende taught me that you need to be paying attention to your environment. Their families have lived on these bayous there, as long as their family history goes, sort of like my family at the beach in LA. And they started to notice that the moss was dying. And when you're in a place this green, when the moss starts to die, it becomes a pretty big concern. Then the turtles went blind. Then the animals they had on their property started to die of cancer, and they had birth defects, right? The eggs that were laid were very deformed. And then their family members that all live on this bayou together started dying of cancer, started experiencing many birth defects as well. They found out that this huge petrochemical facility right upwind and upstream of them had been contaminating their bayou, and they were no longer able to shrimp. So they lost a lot of their economic support from this land that their family had been tending for hundreds of years. So it's important that we find these stories of these fishermen, these hunters, these folks that really know the land and live there, because they'll let you know, like, once you see that moss die, we should act then and not wait until we start to see folks ending up in a clinic, right? That was another very strange experience for me, learning about this swamp community and that local knowledge, those experts. And here's one I'd like to close on. I'm just for these pictures, we see like a kind of like a little league field, right? Looks like probably the little league field in your town. We see a playground, probably looks something similar to what the playground is in your town. And you can't quite see it in these pictures, but the fence line of these properties is the Love Canal Superfund site, where a huge dump was created, and then a housing, just a middle income, just regular neighborhood was built on this next to this dump site. I got to meet Luella Kenny here, and she taught me so much about her young family, losing her son to what they think to this pollution that was seeping into their land, and just the heartbreak of all the young families and pregnant moms in this area that were put at risk. So I also like to show this, right, that it's not just about the natural environments that we live in, but it's also your neighborhood, and just like these everyday American neighborhoods that, I mean, the experts are there too, right? We really need to be listening to all of our community members and valuing their voice, because the moms in this community were able to organize together under the leadership of folks like Luella Kenny. They were able to get evacuated from this site and start their life somewhere healthier. But without, and I think they actually like kidnapped an EPA official. It got to be pretty extreme. And these stories, these experts are so important for our, moving forward. And so, yeah, I'll just leave it. Who's the expert for your research and what you do? There's me in the lab. So I promise I'm a real scientist and super nerd, but when I go out into the community and the work that I do and what I'm proud of in my career, some of it's in the lab, but most of it is not. So it's just something to consider as scientists. Who's the expert, and what is your real legacy going to be? Because I don't think anyone here is ever going to read my thesis. So I hope that we just keep that in mind while we think about what a real career as a scientist means, and making a difference in the world. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sky. That was wonderful. Before I hand it over to our third speaker, I just want to note that a few folks have introduced themselves in the chat. I really appreciate that, and I encourage everyone to add your name and where you're coming from, either geographically or institutionally, and it would be great to get a sense of this really cool group that's joined today. So with that, I will introduce Natasha for our third talk today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay and see my screen? Yes, excellent, thank you. So good day, everyone. I am just here to basically tell you a little bit more about how you can get involved in community science, citizen science at the AGU level and beyond. So Thriving Earth Exchange is a program of AGU that started about 10 years ago, when AGU senior leaders noticed that AGU's mission was only being half accomplished. Our mission was to promote discovery in Earth and space science for the benefit of humanity. Our researchers and scientists were not being given the opportunity really to benefit humanity, so that second part of the mission, through AGU auspices. So Thriving Earth Exchange essentially provides the opportunity for community leads, communities of place, advocacy groups, interest groups, and scientists to connect to advance communities' priorities related to climate, natural hazards, natural resources, environmental health, resilience, sustainability, and pollution. So you can see a couple of our projects here. The one on the right, basically showing during the pandemic, working in the Southeast Ohio Valley, working on hydraulic fracturing projects. So while that is our core work, is to connect communities and scientists, we're also starting to share our community science approach, both near and far, through our online learning management system with partners around the world. So I'll tell you a little bit about our model of community science. You heard from Ryan earlier about how community science is defined, essentially communities and scientists working together to advance a community priority. And our community science approach is a very flexible and essentially a guiding framework which enables community science for anyone basically to adopt it and enable community science in their places. So in sum, Thriving Earth services are entirely free to communities. Projects are served by completely volunteer pro bono scientists and volunteer project managers, otherwise known as community science fellows. Projects typically last anywhere from half a year to about 18 months, depending on the scope of the project. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see our process wheel, which basically shows a very flexible framework, even though it doesn't look very flexible, but the wheel is supposed to connote that. So all projects basically start in scope, where they are honed and basically developed into that 6 to 18 month project. Then when they go to match, relevant scientists are interviewed and recommended for community leads to choose. And then on into solve, the communities and the scientists work together to develop a project plan, a communications plan, and basically to do the project. So through it all, we ask our project teams to consider how they can share the work that they're doing at all stages. That's that little green circle in the middle, arrow in the middle. So projects typically receive a pro bono scientist or a technical expert, sometimes up to 5, depending on the project specific needs. And last but certainly not least, each of the communities that come into Thriving Earth Exchange receive a dedicated volunteer project manager, as I mentioned, a community science fellow, who basically helps to bridge the gaps between the community and the scientists and develop those community plans and project communication plans. So if you were here from the beginning, you did hear what community science was. I just want to talk a little bit about how community science benefits both communities and the scientists. Why do community science? As you heard from Sky's talk, there's so many reasons to do it. And citizen science is so very much engaging, but there are several specific benefits that we see at Thriving Earth Exchange that community science basically supports communities to become more resilient and sustainable. It enhances communities' ability to participate in, contribute to, and guide and benefit from science. So it's not just communities engaging, but it's really very, very deep participation on par with the scientists involved. And by advancing community science, we're helping to help solve the big global challenges like climate change, one bite-sized step at a time, because Thriving Earth projects are not meant to go on forever. For the science and the scientists in the room, community science really helps to generate new research questions and approaches. It increases public support for the sciences, and it helps scientists hone their skills and prepare for diverse careers. So as I mentioned, community science is that equitable collaboration of science and research with communities primarily aimed at outcomes for the benefit of those communities. It's never it's never necessarily for the research agenda per se. Work can be collaboratively or even community-led. Our 3 guiding principles at Thriving Earth Exchange are to 1, begin with community priorities. Communities always drive the bus, as we say. 2, end with those community outcomes. For us, a paper is not an outcome. It might be something that a community wants and might be done in collaboration with a community, but is not necessarily the outcome of community science projects. And then science is a human right. Every community, whatever type of community they are, deserves the right to ask and seek answers to their scientific questions. And then we have one purpose at Thriving Earth Exchange: to offer our sciences with humility to the cooperative project of building a just and sustainable society. So I want to invite all of you to, come into the community science network. We have so many different opportunities regardless of where you are. If you are a community leader yourself, or you know of community leads, please do encourage them to apply to start a project with us. We run quarterly cohorts. The next is starting in March, with a deadline of the 19th of January. We also have that Community Science Fellows program for anyone interested in learning our community science approach and working directly with the community. If you're interested in that, you should apply by the 26th of January for that March cohort. And if you're just a scientist interested, like Sky, for instance, and you want to work directly on a variety of different types of projects, we have a wide variety of projects right now seeking scientists. And if those don't necessarily need your particular skill set, you can also sign up in our community science database, which is that link there. And we will consider you for future opportunities. And then simply, if you're just interested in following us and learning more, you can sign up for our newsletter and follow us on Twitter at Thriving Earth. A couple of other opportunities that are really exciting that have started most recently is we have our Community Science Exchange Hub, which is a new peer-reviewed journal. And it's a hub where communities and scientists can connect, learn about each other, and you can publish more than just articles here. So this is a really awesome opportunity to contribute what you are developing with communities in your respective locations. So that's at communityscienceexchange.org. And then finally, this is coming up really, really soon. It's on the 7th of October. AGU's been very lucky to receive a grant to basically understand and encourage NSF to provide more funding for community science. So this could mean like millions of dollars. So if you're interested in being part of a workshop and providing input, please go to resiliencethrough-science.org. And I look forward to including you. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Natasha, and thank you to all three of our panelists. I now want to do two different things by way of starting our discussion. The first is, let me just share my screen here. The first is to launch a poll with a few questions that our panel came up with collectively. So I'm going to launch that now, and we didn't have a chance to run through the poll to test run this, so I'm hoping it's working. Can everyone see the poll? Awesome. And
looks good.
Great. So I thought this would be an interesting way to just understand where people are coming from across the group of participants, but also some perspectives on some of the things we've just heard about. And so with that, I think we'd like to also encourage folks to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or offer a reflection on what we've been talking about today. And while folks get a chance to think about that, I wonder if any of the panelists have questions for each other. I'm blindsiding you with that, sorry.
I'm curious for Jennifer and Natasha, what researchers are most often participating in like Citizen Science Association or Thriving Earth Exchange? Is there like a discipline that is doing really great right now for these projects?
I'm happy to start, Jennifer. Oh, that's a great question, Sky. When I started with Thriving Earth Exchange, I was actually a little dubious as a geographer, a social scientist myself, and a disaster manager, how much Earth and space scientists would be interested in doing this. I was luckily happily surprised and blown out of the water by how many scientists actually were interested. I would say that we don't have enough space scientists, but otherwise the disciplines that tend to work with us more are those that are related very directly to climate. So climate scientists, hydrologists, those types. And yeah, I'm always trying to figure out how we can get more space scientists, planetary scientists involved. So, I'd love to hear more about if there are any on the call or if anyone has ideas. Thanks.
Hey, Scott, thanks for that question. And it's really been fascinating to watch as this field builds more connections. I mentioned that I come from a background in conservation science. And so CSA has been more heavily weighted towards environmental, ecological sciences. But by no means is that our area of focus. One of the things that we really know is that this work is not new. What's new is that we are seeing and beginning to connect the researchers and communities who have been doing this work for a very long time at the margins of their discipline or their area of study. And by connecting across those disciplines, we can both gain access to the traditions that they have drawn upon that are really powerful in many ways and have something each unique to offer, but also draw on the ways that different disciplines are utilizing new technologies, for example, and not just disciplines, but communities and spaces where boundary spanners are making these connections and making these projects possible, like museums and other spaces like that. I will say on the front of planetary sciences, Natasha, there's a huge group of AGU members who are space scientists who may not think of their work immediately in relationship to community-driven problems. We work right now, as it happens, on a partnership with NASA and have been learning to understand the ways that NASA scientists have and are starting to newly approach collaborative research from many, many different areas of work. So I'd be happy to make some connections there. But also emerging research in like biomedical sciences, for example, there's some really exciting stuff happening in that space, but it's everywhere.
I'd just like to add that there are some disciplines where it seems like there are much hazier gray areas when it comes to defining what it is, what citizen science is, and especially in the social sciences, there's such an interesting spectrum. Sometimes you might find a social scientist saying, oh, well, people respond to my surveys, so they're citizen scientists. And it's like, well, I don't know. But then again, depending on how that process worked, maybe there are some interesting ways that could sort of move into a more kind of collaborative citizen science, community science kind of process. So it's always tricky. I see a question from Omega and Brenda Wilson.
Hello, Jennifer. Hello, Scott. Hey, Ryan, and so many other people that we don't know. I'm Omega Wilson with the West End Revitalization Association in Meyer, North Carolina. And our organization can be given part of the credit for fashioning or modifying the acronym JEDI with the double I's and the dollar signs behind it, okay? We had an opportunity based on our 30 years of work to be invited specifically to provide contributions to the United States Department of Justice formation of the new Department of Justice relative to disparities and exclusions based on science data collection by colleges and universities and academicians who suck in billions of dollars every year, but use very little of it to do corrective actions in Black and brown communities where there's civil rights violations. That's the area that we're concerned most about. This past Saturday, we were invited to Warrenton, North Carolina, which is identified as the groundswell that kicked off the national, international term environmental racism. Some of you may or may not know Administrator Michael Regan, EPA administrator. And for the first time, they created an office that combines the Office of Civil Rights and the Office of Environmental Justice that deal with health disparities, air, water, soil toxicities, redlining, fence line of communities and playgrounds and schools that Sky so aptly identified in the photographs. From the swamps of Louisiana in Mississippi where we used to live, to Ohio, to North Carolina where we live now. I think part of the discussion here has left out the fundamental question of what is coming out of the White House of the environmental justice movement. That is a major, major piece. We had a chance to meet and talk with Brenda Mallory Saturday, who is director of the Council for Environmental Quality for all federal agencies. We had a meeting this morning and also last Tuesday, I think on the 20th, with the Deputy Admiral Rachel Levine of the Office of HHS, Health and Human Services. The data we're collecting should be used to correct problems that harm people, like Sky was mentioning earlier. And some of the information we're sharing is on our website. We put it in the chat. So I think there's a little bit of vacuum here, moving beyond the academic concern of collecting data for your use to move beyond your master's and PhD degrees and tenure to correct actions that has been a barrier because of racism, systemic racism in government agencies and colleges and universities, specifically in the former slave states where we are in North Carolina in the South and Region 4 and other parts of the country. That needs to be upfront in this discussion relative to how you correct problems once you identify them and how you challenge the racist institutions that basically is putting science in a hole and devaluing it. We hear that national and international discussion now. So I'll just leave it at that and answer any questions and share any information following. And of course, Jennifer and Sky and myself and some other people who are not on the call have been working on this issue for quite a while now. We must address it not as a fun project, a fun adventure for students and residents, but address it based on what it's doing to people's health and well-being and those who are most in despair, and predominantly people of color and low-income residents throughout the United States, which is in the millions and millions and millions. That needs to be upfront in the discussions, I think. Thanks, and appreciate the opportunity to share and appreciate be a part of the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much.
I'd
Scott,
be happy to follow up. Yeah, because I mean, speaking to my truth right now. So just to follow up on that, in my training, getting to where I am now, I started as an activist. Most people throughout my training told me that I was wasting my time working with communities and that it was a waste of my talent. Even people have said that to me, like my mentors and programs have said that to me. It took like some pretty big fights to even get this community research in my PhD, and that was only like a few years ago that I got my PhD. So it's not easy as a scientist. And then second off, I also want to say that it's also not it's not something that you should attempt to do alone as someone with mostly scientific training to address these disparities and sort of social issues. And I think that's where the Thriving Earth Exchange and CSA and some of these professional networks, where we can link up with our colleagues like in Chicano studies or Indigenous studies, or geographers, right? But getting those connections is how we as scientists can contribute. It's not usually appropriate for me as an environmental science toxicologist to make decisions about, let's say, a farming community's use of pesticides, right? Like I'm not an economist. I need help to help answer the questions the community has from folks in different fields. So yeah, it's definitely like, I think coming into this, it's a big challenge that Omega just gave us all, but you don't do it alone. And we have to really support each other as we move towards those solutions. Because it is tiring. And I think the stories I shared with you, they're sad, and it sticks with me to this day, all the sad stories that I hear. So anyways, just making sure to support each other as we're making it through our careers and training, and as we're trying to find solutions. Thanks.
I'll just add that I really appreciate those perspectives, and one part of it that hits home for me is that, you know, we had a question earlier about which disciplines are represented, but I also like to think about science as a system of institutions. It's not just the National Science Foundation funding universities. You mentioned the Department of Justice, you mentioned Health and Human Services, there's the EPA, USGS, on and on and on. And it's not just a question of them adopting new practices, but moving away from some things that are pretty entrenched and that have been pretty pernicious for a long time. So it's really exciting the work that you and others are doing to institutionalize a new mindset and a new set of practices. And I think Thriving Earth Exchange and CSA are part of that as well. Jennifer, were you going to jump in with a quick comment? And then I think we're going to have to wrap up.
I know we're at closing. I did want to just echo that and thank Omega for calling that out, that these are it's not easy to do this work, and the things that need to be thought about, particularly as academics, can challenge everything that we're trained in and the ways that we're supported to do it. And that's why, that's one of the reasons that CSA emerged as a space to confront these challenges, to connect people across the disciplines who have taken on some of these hard-won lessons, and to point to really powerful resources and allies out there like the West End Revitalization Association that Omega and Brenda have established and the tools that they stand for, and to Thriving Earth Exchange and the trainings that they offer. So I know we focused a little bit on academics here. That's partly the audience that AGU reaches, but we at CSA do connect all of these skills and backgrounds and perspectives, and work for academics and others to know how to gain these skills, where to look for them, and to build these career pathways and eventually reward structures and changes within institutions that begin to recognize, reflect, and appropriately support the kinds of science that can be done in collaboration that has value for both research and communities across the board. So exciting to hear, and so much more to talk about. So thanks, Ryan, for convening this.
Thank you all so much for presenting, for attending. I'm just going to briefly mention there are other ways to connect with the Science and Society section at AGU. One of them, if you're someone who attends the fall meeting, is to be on the lookout for those Science and Society sessions. There are many. I just listed the sort of general community and citizen science one here. Community and citizen science finds its way into many different parts of the AGU fall meeting. So we'll be pulling together resources that show that as the program comes together. And feel free to reach out with ideas and questions. We welcome that. And hope to see you at future dialogue sessions. And with that, we'll close the session. Thank you again to everyone.